Her worst fear arrived in a luxury SUV. A powerful man came to take her baby, but he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the giant who stood in his way. An army ranger, haunted by his past, built a fortress of solitude deep in the Wyoming mountains. All he wanted was silence. But one fateful blizzard brought a pregnant widow to his door, desperate and collapsing. That reluctant rescue would unleash a chain of buried secrets, a confrontation with a ruthless enemy, and a love that both of them believed was lost to them forever. 5 years. 5 years since silence had become Liam O'Connell's only trusted companion. Here in the Wyoming highlands, where the mountains were unforgiving gods and winter was their wrath, silence was a currency he had in abundance. He was a man carved from the granite itself, tall, broad, and weathered by a grief as relentless as the wind that scoured his homestead. The coiled readiness in an army ranger never truly leaves a man, but in Liam it had settled into a quiet, unyielding stillness. His life was a ritual of control, a fortress built to keep the ghosts at bay. Sunrise, coffee, black, feed the horses, their warm breath pluming in the biting air. Fire the forge. The forge was his church, the anvil his altar. Here, with fire and steel and the force of his own 2 hands, he could beat the chaos of his mind into something solid, something with purpose. The rhythmic crash of his hammer against glowing metal was the only sermon he needed, a prayer of oblivion that drowned out the phantom echoes of a woman's laugh and a little girl's chatter. His log home was as disciplined as his routine. Everything had its place, Spartan and severe. Everything except the small, dust-free patch on the mantel where a photograph of a laughing woman with eyes like summer sky and a little girl with bright ribbons in her hair still stood. He never looked directly at it, but he felt its presence always, a constant low-grade ache behind his ribs. He was a giant of a man, yet that small 4-by-6-inch frame was the heaviest thing he owned. Tonight, the storm came not as a guest, but as a conqueror. It swallowed the sky, erased the horizon, and laid siege to his fortress. Liam was prepared. His pantry was stocked, his woodpile high. He welcomed the isolation, the way the blizzard's roar could almost smother the quiet whispers of memory. As the world outside dissolved into a maelstrom of white fury, he stoked the fire, the crackle of pine a familiar comfort. The wind howled a hymn of oblivion, and for a moment he felt something close to peace. And then, beneath the roar, a sound so small, so out of place, it felt like a hallucination, a sound so human it had no business being in the heart of the storm. Tap, tap, tap. A desperate, freezing heartbeat against the heavy wood of his door. For a long moment, he didn't move. The man who had faced down threats on 2 continents was frozen by a sound a child could make. Cursing under his breath, he pulled the heavy bolt back, the wood groaning in protest. He opened the door a crack, and the storm itself seemed to fall inward, a swirl of white fury that deposited a human shape at his feet before he slammed the door shut against the night. It was a woman, her face ashen with cold, a thick winter coat failing to hide the pronounced swell of her belly. The ranger in him took command, his mind a cold checklist of threats: severe hypothermia, probable shock, advanced pregnancy, get her warm, keep her stable. But the man, the husband, the father, wanted to recoil. He hadn't allowed this kind of vulnerability, this terrible, hopeful sign of life, inside his walls for 5 years. He fought the instinct, his training winning out over his grief. His hands, accustomed to the brute force of the forge, moved with a practiced gentleness. He cut away the layers of frozen clothing, his gaze clinical, refusing to linger on the life she carried within her. He wrapped her in his heaviest wool blankets and carried her to the hearth as if she weighed nothing at all. For hours, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the relentless scream of the wind. He worked in silence, forcing hot broth between her pale lips when she stirred, checking her pulse, his face an unreadable mask of concentration. Her presence was an intrusion, a disruption to the sterile peace he had so carefully constructed. Her dark hair was a stark contrast to the pale wood of his floors. The scent of the storm clung to her, a reminder of the chaotic world he had shut out. The ghosts in the room grew restless, awakened by this unexpected guest. Sometime near dawn, the worst of the storm's fury passed, leaving a deep, vibrating silence. The woman's breathing had evened out. He was watching the flames when he heard a soft, shaky gasp. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented. Her gaze drifted past his large frame, drawn to the dance of the firelight. It flickered across the rough stone of the mantel, illuminating the silver frame, the smiling faces held within. Her eyes locked onto the photograph of his wife and daughter, and in their depths, a flicker of profound, devastating understanding. The world outside was a blank page of white, and the silence it left behind pressed in on the cabin's walls, thicker than the snowdrifts. For 2 days they coexisted in this quiet, a man and a woman marooned by the weather and their own private griefs. Liam moved with a brusque efficiency, providing food and keeping the fire roaring, speaking only when necessary. Eat. More wood. Each word was a stone dropped into a deep well. As a nurse, Eleanor was a student of the human body, and she could read the history in Liam O'Connell's frame. She saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the faint silvered scars that crisscrossed his knuckles. But more than that, she saw the way his eyes held a permanent distance, as if he were always looking at a horizon only he could see. They were the eyes of a man standing guard, and she knew instinctively that his deepest wounds were the ones no one could see. She felt she had to say something, to bridge the chasm of silence that separated them. Her voice was quiet, tentative in the heavy air. "I never got to thank you for everything." He was tending the fire, his broad back to her, and only offered a short, sharp nod in reply. She tried again, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. "My husband, Marco, he was an architect. He always dreamed of building a place like this, with his own hands. A place that could stand against anything." The words struck Liam with the force of a physical blow. Dreamed, build, hands. They were the cornerstones of a life that had burned to embers 5 years ago. He saw it all in the flames before him. A half-finished porch swing, blueprints for a treehouse, the ghost of a promise to always be there. He didn't speak, didn't turn. He simply straightened to his full, imposing height, his body going rigid. The heavy latch of the cabin door clicked open, letting in a swirl of frigid, biting air. He strode through the deep snow toward the dark, silent shape of the forge, each step a final, decisive statement. The loud clang of the heavy iron door swinging shut echoed across the snow-muffled landscape. It left Eleanor utterly alone in the sudden quiet, with the chilling realization that she hadn't just been rescued from a storm, but had stumbled into the very heart of one. The rhythmic crash of a hammer on steel carried through the frozen air. It wasn't the sound of work, it was the sound of a battle, a lonely war waged against an unseen enemy. Elena felt it in the floorboards, a percussive heartbeat that seemed to echo the turmoil in the man who had retreated from the cabin. She pulled on one of his oversized coats, the wool smelling of pine smoke and cold leather, and followed the sound into the biting cold. The forge door was slightly ajar, a sliver of hellish orange light cutting through the twilight gloom. She peered inside, hesitant to cross the threshold into what felt like a deeply private ceremony. He was a silhouette against the roaring fire, his powerful frame moving with a desperate, furious grace. The hammer rose and fell, sparks flying like angry stars in the darkness. He was pouring every ounce of his pain into a small piece of glowing iron, trying to beat it into submission, to give it a shape other than grief. He was so lost in his violent meditation that he didn't see her. He worked with a relentless pace until sweat dripped from his brow, his breathing coming in harsh, ragged bursts. He plunged the metal into a slack tub, and a furious hiss of steam filled the air. As he pulled it out to inspect his work in the fire's glow, she saw it. A single, clean track cutting through the soot on his cheek, glistening for a moment before evaporating in the forge's oppressive heat. He wasn't just shaping steel, he was trying to reshape the past. The object in his tongs was not a tool or a horseshoe. It was small, delicate, the unmistakable shape of a prancing horse, a child's toy. The hammering stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was a shock, broken only by the hiss and pop of the coal fire. He finally saw her standing in the shadows, his chest heaving. He didn't look angry, only hollowed out, the fire in his eyes banked to embers. His gaze fell to the beautifully formed iron horse, its shape still radiating a dull heat. His voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper that barely disturbed the air. I wasn't there when they needed me. The morning after the confession broke clear and cruelly bright. Sunlight on the fresh snow was blinding, turning the landscape into a pristine, silent world that offered no hint of the emotional wreckage inside the cabin. An unspoken truce had settled between them. Liam's confession hung in the air, a truth that, once spoken, could not be taken back. He was quieter than ever, but the heavy, volatile anger in the forge had been replaced by a deep, settled sorrow. Just before noon, a lone rider emerged from the pines, a dark, steady shape against the glaring white Sam Jones. He looked as if he'd been born in the saddle, his face a road map of 70 Wyoming seasons. He didn't dismount right away, just sat his horse, his shrewd eyes taking in the unfamiliar tracks around the cabin and the second set of boots by the door. He swung down, his movement stiff but sure, and approached the porch with a heavy sack slung over his shoulder. "Liam," he called out, his voice a low gravel. "See you weathered it." Liam opened the door, his large frame blocking the entrance. Sam. The single word was both a greeting and a statement. Sam's eyes flicked past him to where Eleanor stood near the hearth, a specter of civilization in this wild place. He gave her a slow, respectful nod. "Ma'am." His gaze returned to Liam, and a whole conversation passed between the two men in a shared, silent glance. "Figured you might be running low on coffee," Sam said, hefting the sack. "Brought some things." He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He'd known Liam since he was a boy and understood that the walls around the man's heart were higher and colder than the Teton Range. Seeing a woman inside them was like seeing a wildflower bloom on a frozen peak. Before he turned to leave, Sam reached into his thick leather saddlebag. "Postman couldn't make it past the fork. Left this at my box. Return address is from a law firm in Denver. Figured it might be important." He handed the crisp, heavy envelope to Elena. He saw the name Carlos Garcia printed in stark, embossed letters, and the old rancher's eyes, which had seen blizzards, droughts, and market crashes, narrowed with a familiar sense of foreboding. He gave Liam one last, long look before reining his horse around, leaving them alone once more with the silence and the unwelcome intrusion of the world beyond the storm. The envelope felt cold in her hands, its sharp edges and heavy paper a stark contrast to the rustic warmth of the cabin. It was a piece of another world, a world of concrete and contracts, of men who used words as weapons. For a moment, she just held it, the name Carlos Garcia feeling like a judgment in her palm. He had never approved of her, had seen his brother's love for her as a foolish distraction from the family's corporate ambitions. With a deep, steadying breath, she slid a trembling finger under the seal. The words were typed, impersonal, and couched in the chillingly polite language of concern. But the meaning beneath them was as sharp and clear as broken glass. Deeply troubled by your reckless decision, irresponsible in your delicate condition. To honor Marco's legacy, the family is prepared to provide a more stable and suitable environment for the child. Each phrase was a careful, calculated cut, designed to make her feel small, irrational, and worst of all, unfit. The letter ended with a veiled ultimatum, a mention of legal counsel and the family's desire to ensure the well-being of Marco's heir. The breath she had been holding escaped in a ragged shudder. The dream she and Marco had cherished, a life of meaning built with their own hands, shriveled under the cold weight of Carlos's power. She was a widow, soon to be a mother, with nothing to her name but a piece of untamed land and the contents of a single battered trunk. Against a man like Carlos, she was utterly, terrifyingly helpless. Her hand went instinctively to her belly, a primal urge to shield her child from a threat she couldn't see but could feel in her very bones. She didn't realize she had made a sound, a small, choked gasp, until she saw Liam turn from the window where he'd been watching the distant peaks. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer empty comforts. He simply crossed the room in 2 long strides, his presence immense, and held out his hand. When she didn't respond, her eyes locked on the cruel words. His large, calloused fingers gently took the letter from her nerveless grasp. He read the single page in seconds, his face hardening into something she had not seen before. It wasn't the volatile, grieving anger of the forge. It was something colder, more controlled, and infinitely more dangerous. The muscle in his jaw pulsed, a single hard knot. His eyes, when they finally lifted from the page to meet hers, were like chips of ice, burning with a low, protective fire. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was now charged with his unspoken, unshakable rage. He didn't speak. He simply placed the letter on the table, turned, and strode out into the blinding snow. A moment later, the sharp, violent crack of an axe splitting wood echoed through the valley. It was a sound of pure, focused fury, each blow a punctuation mark to the rage he couldn't put into words. Elena watched from the window as he worked, his powerful body moving with a terrible and efficient grace, the pile of firewood growing at an astonishing rate. He wasn't just preparing for the cold, he was preparing for a war. He returned an hour later, his face flushed from the cold and the exertion, his breathing steady. He stacked the freshly split logs by the hearth with methodical precision, the entire act a silent declaration of his intent to remain, to endure. Then he turned to her, his icy eyes holding hers, the quiet fury now banked into cold, hard purpose. "No one," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, "is taking you from here." It wasn't a promise, it was a statement of fact. The next morning, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. The quiet was no longer born of awkwardness, but of mission. He led her to the barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and horse. Leaning against the wall was a Winchester rifle, its wood stock worn smooth with use, its blue-black steel gleaming in the dim light. "Out here," he said, his tone that of an instructor, not a host. "You don't wait for trouble. You learn to face it." He wasn't just offering her shelter anymore, he was offering her strength. He took her out behind the barn, the snowbanks creating a natural backstop. He showed her how to load, how to work the lever action, how to breathe. He was a patient, exacting teacher, his instructions clear and concise. He stood behind her to adjust her stance, his presence a wall of solid warmth against the biting wind. "Brace it firm against your shoulder, or it'll kick you good." His large, calloused hand covered hers on the stock to steady her aim, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. A jolt, sharp and unexpected as a static shock, passed between them. It had nothing to do with the cold, and everything to do with the sudden, startling warmth of his touch against the cold steel of the rifle. They both froze for a fraction of a second, the world narrowing to that single point of contact. He pulled his hand back as if burned, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before the mask of the instructor slammed back into place. There was one door in the cabin that remained closed. It was an unassuming plank of pine, but in the week she'd been there, Eleanor had learned it was as heavily barred as a vault door. One afternoon, while Liam was out mending a fence line broken by the storm, An impulse she couldn't explain led her to it. Her hand hesitated on the simple latch, feeling like an intruder. But something, a shared sense of loss, a mother's instinct, pushed her forward. She gently pushed the door open. The air inside was still and cold, smelling faintly of cedar and forgotten childhood. It was a little girl's room, frozen in time. A hand-carved mobile of a bear and a deer hung motionless over a small, empty crib. On a low shelf, a copy of Goodnight Moon lay next to a stuffed rabbit with one button eye. It wasn't a room of neglect. It was a shrine, a place where time had been ordered to stop. A fine layer of dust coated everything, a delicate shroud that spoke of years of untouched sorrow. Moved by a compassion that went beyond words, she found a soft cloth and began to gently, reverently wipe the dust away. She was polishing the smooth, worn curve of a small wooden rocking horse when a shadow fell across the doorway. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Liam stood there, utterly motionless, his face pale beneath his tan. All the iron, all the controlled anger had drained away from him, leaving only a raw, bottomless chasm of pain in his eyes. He looked at her, then at the room, as if seeing it for the first time in years. For a full minute, he just stood there on the threshold he had never allowed himself to cross, his big body trembling almost imperceptibly. Elena held her breath, expecting him to order her out, to rebuild the wall she had just breached. Instead, with an effort that seemed to cost him everything, he took a single, shuddering step into the room. He sank down onto the edge of the tiny bed, the frame groaning under his weight. He stared at his own hands, calloused and capable, the hands of a man who could bend steel but couldn't hold his world together. Her name was Chloe, he said, his voice a rough whisper, a stranger to his own ears. My wife was Sarah. He didn't look at her, only at the empty space in the room. There was a drunk driver, an icy road back from town. I was deployed, in Afghanistan. Got the news in a tent halfway around the world. He finally looked up, and the guilt in his eyes was so profound it was like a physical wound. My only job, my one job, was to protect my family. And I wasn't here. His confession left a new kind of silence in its wake, not of distance, but of a shared, fragile humanity. They were no longer just a man and a woman, but two survivors, each having now witnessed the deepest scar the other carried. That stillness was shattered the following afternoon, not by words, but by the sky itself, which turned from a brilliant blue to a bruised, violent purple with terrifying speed. This storm was no guest. It was a predator, throwing itself against the cabin with a malevolent force that made the log walls groan and the windows rattle in their frames. It was in the heart of this renewed siege that Elena cried out, a sharp, sudden sound that was not of the wind. She gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, her knuckles white, her face suddenly pale with sweat. "Liam," she gasped, her voice tight with a nurse's professional dread. "It's too soon. The baby. It's coming now." Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the storm outside a distant, irrelevant roar. In an instant, the soldier and the nurse took over. He became a blur of focused energy, his own grief and trauma locked away behind the iron discipline of his ranger training. He moved with purpose, boiling water, gathering every clean cloth he could find, his voice a low, calming anchor in the chaos. She, fighting waves of pain that stole her breath, became his commanding officer, her voice strained but clear, guiding him, telling him what she needed, what to look for. The hours that followed were a primal dance of pain, fear, and sheer will. Liam's hands, which could shape unforgiving steel, were now impossibly gentle, wiping her brow, supporting her, a steady presence in the storm of her pain. "Breathe, Eleanor," he murmured, his voice close to her ear, a constant, steady rhythm. "Just like we practiced with the rifle. Control the breath." She clung to his words, to the solid strength of his arm, drawing on a courage she didn't know she possessed. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, there was only the sound of her ragged breaths and his low, steady voice. "You can do this, Elena. You're strong enough." With one final, agonized cry that seemed to tear the very fabric of the world apart, the baby was born into his waiting, capable hands. For one heart-stopping, eternal second, the only sound was the howling wind, a void of terrifying silence. Then, a tiny, wavering cry cut through the tempest, a sound so fragile, so vulnerable, yet so defiant, it seemed to momentarily silence the storm itself. It was the sound of life, improbable and tenacious in the heart of the wilderness. The storm had spent its fury, leaving a world scoured clean and silent under a sky full of stars. But inside the cabin, the true battle had just begun. They named her Luna, for she had been born in the darkest hour of the night, a small, pale light against an overwhelming blackness. She was so small, her breaths shallow, her cries thin and reedy. The world, for Liam and Eleanor, shrank to the size of the tiny, fragile being swaddled in blankets. The next days blurred into a sleepless, hushed vigil. Eleanor, running on a mother's sheer will and a nurse's training, became a fierce guardian of that tiny flame of life. She coaxed droplets of milk and sugar water between the baby's lips. She listened to the rhythm of her lungs. She charted every subtle change, and Liam became her silent, unwavering shadow. He kept the fire perfectly banked, turning the cabin into a steady, warm incubator. A cup of hot broth was always by her side before she even knew she needed it. They moved around each other with an unspoken, exhausted grace, a team forged in the crucible of that stormy night, their shared purpose, the tiny beating heart in the cradle he had moved beside the hearth. On the third night, a new terror arrived, a fever. Elena felt the unnatural heat on the baby's skin, and a cold dread washed over her. Her hands, usually so steady during medical crises, began to tremble. All her knowledge, all her training, felt useless against the vast, indifferent wilderness outside and the fragility of the life in her arms. For the first time she looked at Liam, her professional calm shattered, her eyes wide with a mother's raw, pleading fear. Liam didn't hesitate. The soldier who had faced death without flinching now faced a different, more terrifying enemy. He took his cleanest flannel shirt from a peg and with a single sharp tear ripped a long strip from the hem. He dipped it in cool, clean water from the basin. His massive, scarred hands that could tame wild horses and bend iron, were impossibly gentle as he bathed the baby's tiny, feverish brow. And then a sound drifted into the tense silence of the room, a sound more unexpected than the storm. It was a low, humming melody, rough and slightly out of tune, but full of an ancient, aching tenderness. Elena watched, tears streaming unchecked down her face, as this broken man, this solitary giant, instinctively hummed the lullaby he had once sung to the ghost in the empty room. He wasn't just tending to a stranger's child. He was being a father again. The peace that followed Luna's recovery was as fragile as a skim of ice on a pond. For a week, their world was the three of them, a small, unlikely constellation orbiting the quiet rhythm of the baby's breaths. Then, one morning, a black shape crested the distant ridge, crawling down the muddy, half-thawed track to the homestead. It was a luxury SUV, sleek and predatory, and utterly alien in the wild landscape. Liam saw it first, his body tensing with the instinct of a soldier sensing an enemy approach. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored cashmere coat and leather shoes that were instantly ruined by the mud. He moved with the impatient arrogance of a man who owned every room he entered. It was Carlos Garcia. He strode to the porch, his eyes sweeping over the rustic cabin with unconcealed disdain before fixing on Eleanor, who had come to the door holding Luna wrapped tightly in a blanket. "Elena, thank God," he said, his voice sharp and cutting through the clean mountain air, completely ignoring the giant of a man who stood silent and watchful beside her. "I've been worried sick. This foolishness ends now. We're getting you out of this place." "Carlos, it's not what you think," Elena said, her voice stronger than she expected. "We're safe here." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Safe? Here?" "With him?" He finally acknowledged Liam with a dismissive wave. "Elena, you're emotional. You've just been through a trauma. You're not thinking clearly. Marco's son will not be raised in a hovel like this." He took a decisive step toward the door, his intent clear. "Now, go pack a small bag for yourself and the child. My driver will handle the rest. We'll be back in Denver before nightfall." Elena instinctively pulled Luna closer, her body forming a protective shield. "No, we're not going anywhere." Carlos's face hardened, the mask of false concern dropping to reveal a cold, ruthless determination. "Don't be a fool. You have nothing. I have lawyers. You will come with me now, or I will file for emergency custody by noon tomorrow, and I will win. Don't test me on this." He reached out as if to take her arm and physically pull her from the doorway. Before his fingers could touch her sleeve, Liam was there. He hadn't seemed to move, but suddenly he was a wall of solid muscle and flannel between Carlos and the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The words were a low, guttural rumble, the sound of granite grinding against granite. "That's far enough." Carlos looked up, momentarily stunned by the sheer size of the man blocking his path. "And just who are you to stop me?" Liam looked down at the smaller man, his eyes flat and cold as a winter sky. "The man who's telling you," he said softly, "that you'll have to go through me." The standoff held for a breathless moment, a duel between city steel and mountain stone. Carlos's handsome face was tight with fury, unaccustomed to being defied by anyone, let alone a backwoods blacksmith. Liam didn't move a muscle, a silent sentinel at the gate, his sheer presence an unbreachable wall. The air crackled with the unspoken promise of violence. Then a new sound intruded, the low rumble of an engine, the crunch of tires on the muddy track. An old, mud-splattered Ford pickup pulled up behind Carlos's pristine SUV, its engine rumbling like a contented bear. Sam Jones got out, moving with the unhurried pace of a man who owned his time. From another truck that followed, two more ranchers emerged. Men with calloused hands and faces like cured leather. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. They just moved to stand, flanking the porch, their silence more potent and deeply rooted than any shouted threat. Carlos looked from one weathered face to another, his composure finally cracking. This was a power dynamic he didn't understand, an equation that couldn't be solved with money or lawyers. "This is a private family matter," he snapped, his voice a pitch too high. "You have no business here." Sam Jones calmly took off his worn Stetson, holding it in his hands. "Morning," he said, his voice mild but carrying the weight of the mountains behind him. "See, up here, a man's troubles are his own, right up until they're not. Liam's one of us." He paused, his gaze shifting to Elena and the baby with a quiet protectiveness. "Which means the folks under his roof are too." As if on cue, the passenger door of Sam's truck opened and a woman with silver-braided hair stepped out. It was his wife, Martha. She carried a basket covered with a red-checkered cloth, and she paid no mind to Carlos, her eyes, full of a grandmother's warmth, fixed only on Elena. She walked right past the fuming man from the city, up the porch steps, and stood before Elena. "We heard there was a new arrival," she said, her voice as warm and comforting as the steam that rose when she pulled back the cloth to reveal a golden, freshly baked loaf of bread. She placed the basket into Elena's free hand, her own work-roughened fingers briefly patting Elena's. "It's not much, but a new mother needs her strength." Then she smiled, a genuine, all-encompassing welcome that banished the last of the fear from the air. Just wanted to say, "Welcome home, dear." Martha's simple words, "Welcome home," shifted something fundamental in the air. The power had moved from the man with the money and the lawyers to the woman holding the loaf of bread. Empowered by the quiet circle of strangers standing behind her, Eleanor felt a strength she hadn't known since her husband's death. She turned to face her brother-in-law, her fear replaced by a calm, unshakable certainty. Her voice was clear, carrying in the still mountain air, devoid of anger or pleading. "You're wrong about Marco's dream, Carlos. It was never just about a house. It was about a life." She looked at Sam and Martha, whose faces held a quiet encouragement. Then her eyes met Liam's, who watched her with a fierce, unwavering pride. He wanted to build a life where people mattered more than profit, where community meant more than contracts, a life that was strong enough to stand on its own, not just on the family name. She adjusted Luna in her arms, looking down at her daughter's sleeping face. "His legacy isn't something you can lock away in a trust fund, Carlos. It's this." Her gesture took in the rugged mountains, the steadfast faces of her new neighbors, and the giant of a man who had become her sanctuary. It's her, and it's her being raised in a place where she is safe and strong and loved. She finally looked directly at him, her eyes clear and honest. "This is Marco's dream. It's just taking a different shape than we planned." Carlos stared at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he seemed to truly see the baby, not as an asset or an heir, but as a child, his brother's child. He looked past Elena at the silent, weathered faces of the ranchers, men who would clearly stand here until the spring thaw if they had to, men who operated on a code of loyalty he could never comprehend. He was a king in his own world of boardrooms and courtrooms, but he was a foreigner here. His power was a foreign currency, utterly worthless in this valley. Without another word, he gave a single stiff nod. It was not an apology, but it was a concession, a surrender. He turned, his expensive shoes crunching on the muddy ground, and got back into his pristine vehicle. The sound of its engine was an intrusion, and then it faded, leaving behind only the sigh of the wind in the pines and the soft coo of a waking baby. The threat was gone. They had faced the world, and they had won, not with threats or force, but with a loaf of bread and the quiet strength of a valley that took care of its own. A year can be an eternity. It can be long enough for a mountain to shed its winter coat, for a fragile seed to take root, and for a fortress of grief to become a home. Spring had returned to the Wyoming highlands, not with the brutal, sudden thaw of the previous year, but with a gentle, assured warmth that coaxed wildflowers from the earth. The sound of Liam's hammer still rang from the forge, but it was a different sound now, less a battle, more a song. It mingled with the new sounds of the homestead, the happy babble of a little girl chasing a clumsy butterfly, and the soft hum of Eleanor singing as she tended the thriving garden that now bloomed where once there was only snow. The cabin was no longer just a cabin. A new wing, its raw pines smelling sweet in the cool air, was nearly complete. It was a testament to a future they were building together, a space for more life, more love. The empty room was empty no longer. It was now Luna's, filled with light and laughter, the hand-carved mobile turning gently in the breeze. The ghosts had not been banished, but they had found peace. The photograph on the mantel now had company, a picture of a dark-haired man with a dreamer's smile, Marco, and beside it a small worn drawing of a stick-figure family under a bright yellow sun, a gift from a neighbor's child. That evening, they stood together on the new, unfinished porch. The sun was setting, painting the jagged peaks in hues of rose and gold. Luna, now a sturdy toddler with her mother's dark, curious eyes and a chin that was all Liam's, slept soundly in his arms, her small hand clutching the collar of his worn flannel shirt. She was the living, breathing heart of their new world, a perfect bridge between the man forged in the mountains and the woman who had brought the sea of her own strength to him. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on his arm, and they watched the last light fade. They didn't need many words anymore. They had built a new language here, a language of shared glances over a dinner table, of quiet comforts in the deep of night, of the steady, dependable rhythm of a life rebuilt piece by piece. He had taught her the resilience of the mountains, and she had taught him that even the hardest ground could bloom again. He looked down at her, her face soft in the twilight, then at the child sleeping against his heart. The last of the 5-year winter finally melted from his soul, washed away by the steady, quiet warmth of a love he never thought he would feel again. "Elena," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer feared. "Thank you for bringing the spring back. Wasn't that a journey?" Liam and Elena's story is a powerful reminder that even after the longest winter, the human heart can find its way back to spring. If you believe that love deserves a second chance, would you do us a small favor and just type the number 1 in the comments below? It lets our small community know this story found a home with you. And if you want your heart warmed again, be sure to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss the next story we have waiting for you. Thank you for sharing this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.